I told you? The princess without voice.
You may think stands on two legs, right? But
capable of language, of understanding.
Me, he does not know how I am Get him out. What are you talking about?
Don't do this, Eliza.
What is she saying?
The Shape of Water. 2017. This text presents a complete analysis and explanation of Guillermo del Toro's film, exploring its narrative, themes, characters, and cinematic language in depth. The film opens with a dreamlike underwater sequence, a floating bedroom suspended in a flooded apartment, which immediately establishes water not merely as a setting, but as the film's central psychic and visual metaphor for a preconscious state of being, a fluid world without rigid boundaries, a realm of silence and possibility that the protagonist carries within her. This introduction, narrated by Giles, frames the entire story as a fairy tale for troubled times, a story about a princess without a voice, immediately signaling to the audience that what they are about to witness operates on the logic of parable and myth rather than gritty realism, even as it is firmly set in a meticulously recreated historical period. Del Toro uses this opening to prime us for a narrative that values emotional truth over literal truth, asking us to suspend disbelief not just in a creature, but in the transformative power of love itself, a force depicted as being as natural and inevitable as the tides. The first time we see Elisa Esposito in her waking life, her daily routine is rendered as a precise, almost balletic ritual performed in silence, a sequence that communicates her isolation but also her complete self-sufficiency. She boils eggs, masturbates in the bath, shines her shoes, and prepares for work, all without a single word of dialogue, demonstrating that her muteness is not an absence of a full life, but a different kind of fullness, a rich interior world that Hawkins plays with a luminous transparency, her face a constantly shifting landscape of curiosity, loneliness, and desire. The film's production design, which won a richly deserved Oscar, creates a world of profound textural contrast, where Elisa's apartment, perched above a decaying movie palace, is a sanctuary of green and teal, the colors of water and memory, a space that feels organic and alive with shifting light patterns from the rain-streaked windows, as if the entire room were submerged in a gentle lagoon. A stark counterpoint to the brutally sterile, yellow and gray government laboratory, where she works. A. Space designed to be so inhumanly angular and cold that it makes Strickland's sadism seem like a natural product of the environment. This laboratory, with its massive pressure chambers and blinding concrete corridors, represents the apex of Cold War rationality, a place where everything, including a god, can be reduced to an asset, to be dissected and weaponized, and the film's visual grammar consistently links this sterile environment to Strickland's own decaying soul, his world of perfectly shined shoes and manicured suburban lawns hiding a festering rot. The creature's tank room, by contrast, becomes a liminal space, a cathedral of shadows where water dances on the walls, a place where the industrial and the sacred uneasily coexist, and when Elisa first truly interacts with the amphibian man, the camera pushes in on their hands pressed against the glass, a direct visual quote from Creature from the Black Lagoon, but with a crucial difference. Here, the woman does not recoil but recognizes, a moment of mutual seeing that the entire film hinges upon. Strickland's introduction is a masterclass in establishing menace through the mundane. His motivational speech about decency and the biblical justification for his superiority is delivered with the folksy cadence of a man who genuinely believes he is the hero of his own story, and the cattle prod he wields, which he has nicknamed his Alabama how-to-do, is not just a weapon but a phallic symbol of the toxic masculinity he embodies, a white patriarchal order that enforces conformity through violence. When he tortures the creature, it is shot with a terrifying intimacy, the camera lingering on the electrical arcs and the creature's silent screams, an echo of the real-life violence being broadcast on Giles's television set, where civil rights protesters are battered with fire hoses. The film is not simply making a metaphor, but drawing a direct, causal line between the state's brutalization of a river god in a lab and the state's brutalization of its own citizens in the streets. Strickland's rotting fingers, reattached in a medical procedure that he brags about with a horrifying pride, are a Del Toro signature, the body refusing to conceal the corruption of the soul, a physical manifestation of gangrene that grows as his moral sickness deepens, a visual representation of the idea that the monster is not the one who looks different, but the one who uses his power to enforce his own image upon the world. Sally Hawkins' performance as Elisa is a high-wire act that redefines the silent film tradition for a modern sensibility. She channels the pathos of Chaplin, the expressive grace of Keaton, and the elegant glamour of Hepburn. But the result is entirely her own, a woman who is not a victim, but a protagonist with fierce appetites and a will of iron. The scene where she signs to Giles, explaining her determination to free the creature, is the emotional core of the movie, a desperate, funny, and profoundly moving declaration of love that she translates as, "He does not know what I lack or how I am incomplete. He sees me as I am." This moment articulates the film's romantic thesis, which is not that love completes an incomplete person, but that love recognizes the completeness that is already there, hidden from a world that defines you by your scars, your skin, your sexuality, or your species. The fact that this declaration is spoken aloud by Giles, giving voice to a mute woman's words, is a canny bit of narrative structure, highlighting the alliance between the film's marginalized characters, a coalition of the othered who must literally speak for each other to be heard. Giles himself, played with a heartbreaking tenderness by Richard Jenkins, is more than a sidekick narrator. He is a parallel protagonist whose arc about unrequited love and professional obsolescence mirrors the larger themes of a world that discards anything it deems unnatural or unprofitable. His crush on the young, conventionally handsome man at the pie counter, a man who is explicitly revealed to be virulently racist and homophobic behind a charming smile, is a brutal miniature of the closet's cruel logic, the internalized shame that can make the object of your desire a source of your own oppression. When Giles later opens his door to find the amphibian man, who has devoured one of his beloved cats, the initial shock and horror give way to an even more shocking moment of healing, where the creature, with a gentle touch, restores not only the wounds on Giles's arm but the hair on his balding head, an act of miraculous grace that symbolizes the acceptance Giles craves from a world that constantly tells him he is too old and too queer to be desirable. This moment of healing is not just a plot point. It is the film's secret message about art, that true beauty sees your wounds and, instead of punishing you for them, makes you whole again. Zelda Fuller, played by Octavia Spencer, is the practical, grounding presence without whom the fairy tale cannot function, And the film does not shy away from the specific precarity of her position as a black woman in 1962. Her constant chatter is not comic relief, but a survival strategy, a way of filling the silence with a persona that makes her less of a target in a world that would see her as entirely disposable. Her marriage, depicted in a few brutally efficient scenes, is a portrait of a different kind of silence, a domestic arrangement where her voice is ignored even by her own husband, who ultimately betrays her secret under the threat of Strickland's violence. A devastating illustration of how systemic racism and misogyny can fracture solidarity from the inside. When Zelda covers for Elisa's lateness with a string of breathless lies, it is hilarious, but it is also an act of profound courage, a small, daily heroism that the film refuses to let go unnoticed, reminding us that the grand romance between Elisa and the creature is made possible by a network of small, brave acts performed by people who have far more to lose. The character of Dr. Robert Hofstetler, who is secretly the Soviet spy Dmitry Mosenkov, complicates the film's political landscape. Significantly, refusing to let the story devolve into a simple Cold War binary of good Americans versus evil Russians. He is a scientist who genuinely respects the creature as a marvel of nature, and his ideological conflict with his Moscow handlers is as stark as his moral conflict with Strickland, placing him in a treacherous middle ground where pure scientific awe is an endangered value. His reluctant aid of Elisa's plot, and his final, fatal act of defiance where he is pumped full of a truth serum that makes him recite a children's nursery rhyme in his native tongue as he dies, frames him as a tragic figure, a man whose humanity is literally drugged out of him by a system that treats all life, regardless of nationality, as raw material for the great game of empire. The use of the Russian folk rhyme, an echo of a lost childhood and a lost innocence, is a poignant touch that universalizes the film's theme of otherness, suggesting that even a spy, in his dying moments, is just a child of his own culture, singing a song that no one around him can understand. The physical design and performance of the amphibian man, brought to life by Doug Jones under layers of latex and paint, are a triumph of practical filmmaking that gives the creature a tangible presence impossible to achieve with CGI. His large, expressive eyes, modeled partly on Del Toro's own, are windows to a soul that is simultaneously ancient and innocent. A creature who is a god in his own context, but becomes a terrified animal in chains, and Jones's balletic, weight-shifting movement, uncannily amphibious, makes the eventual romance not absurd but inevitable, a meeting of two beings who live in their bodies with a singular grace. The design is intentionally evocative of the Gill Man, a classic universal monster, but Del Toro's profound innovation is to take the creature's shimmering iridescence, a quality that could be read as monstrous, and transform it into a quality of sublime, alien beauty, making him not a beast that needs to become a prince, but a prince who is perfectly content to remain a beast. The scenes where Elisa teaches him language using eggs and simple gestures, a kind of interspecies pigeon signing, are tender and playful, a courtship that unfolds in a silent, gestural cinema that predates spoken dialogue, a love story told in the universal language of mutual gift-giving. The film's central sexual sequences are remarkably frank and necessary. They are not gratuitous but are foundational to the film's argument that love, in its truest form, is an act of radical embodiment that does not flee from the other's strangeness but embraces it. Elisa's decision to flood her bathroom, blocking the door with towels and letting the water fill the entire space, is an act of creation, a transformation of her small, domestic world into a primordial ocean where the normal rules of gravity and society do not apply, a shared amniotic sac for their union. The explicit, nonverbal consent and mutual pleasure of their love scene is a powerful counter-narrative to the violent, possessive sexuality represented by Strickland, whose silent, passionless sex with his wife, where he bleeds on her and commands her to be quiet, is portrayed as the real perversion, an act of domination that has no room for true vulnerability. Here, Del Toro's inversion of fairy tale logic is complete. The monster's erotic touch is healing, while the human patriarch's touch is a wound that will not stop bleeding. The role of music in the film operates on multiple planes, with Alexander Desplat's Academy Award-winning score serving as a constant, liquid underscore, its whimsical waltz and accordion trills evoking a Parisian riverside as much as an Amazonian tributary, creating a sense of timeless, borderless romance that floats above the historical specificity. The diegetic music, however, is just as crucial. The Benny Goodman records that Elisa plays for the creature are not just a mood setter but a form of communication, a shared appreciation of swing and rhythm that functions as a third language between her signing and his silence, a vibration in the air that proves they are on the same wavelength. The film's most audacious break from reality is the black and white dance fantasy sequence, a full-blown Hollywood musical number where Elisa, in a glamorous gown, twirls with the creature through an Art Deco ballroom, a direct homage to Astaire and Rogers, which risks sentimentality but lands with aching sincerity because it is framed as a dream, an interior wish fulfillment that the real world can never permit, but which art can give to us as a fleeting, precious gift. The recurring motif of eggs is a dense, elusive symbol that works on several levels simultaneously. They are a simple, practical food, a source of protein that Elisa methodically consumes and shares, but they are also symbols of nascent life, of a fragile shell protecting a liquid interior, a perfect metaphor for the creature himself, for Elisa's own sealed-off life, and for the love that is about to hatch between them. When Elisa places a hard-boiled egg on the counter and signs the lesson, egg, she is not just teaching vocabulary. She is offering a ritual object, a small, smooth, warm globe that the creature accepts with a reverence that makes the mundane transcendent. The film's title sequence, a swirling underwater abstraction of an egg, reinforces this, establishing the egg as the film's primary visual talisman, a promise of a new kind of life that can only be born from the union of the human and the truly other. The dialogue that serves as the film's ethical thesis is Strickland's chilling remark about the creature. We're created in the Lord's image. You don't think that's what the Lord looks like, do you? It's human. He looks like a human. Like me. Or even you. Maybe a little more like me, I guess. This layered statement, delivered with Shannon's peerless ability to be both terrifying and pathetically insecure, encapsulates the history of oppression in a few short sentences, the logic by which the powerful create God in their own image, and then use that projection to dehumanize anyone who does not fit the mold. The fact that he corrects himself, maybe a little more like me, is the final, devastating touch, revealing that even the grudging inclusion of, or even you directed at a black woman is a lie, a temporary courtesy that collapses instantly under the weight of his narcissism, proving that a hierarchy of being always has him, the white male, at the solitary apex. Elisa's origin story, that she was found as an infant by a river, an orphan with mysterious scars on her neck, is classic fairy tale lore but also a radical biological clue that reframes her entire identity. The film gently suggests that she was never fully human to begin with, that she is a kind of changeling, a creature of the water who was marooned on land, and her muteness is not a defect, but a remnant of an evolutionary state that does not require speech. This retroactive twist, only fully realized at the climax, recontextualizes every moment of the film. Her comfort in the bath, her affinity for green, her immediate, uncanny connection with the creature, and her feeling of being incomplete, which is not a neurotic human anxiety, but a literal, physiological longing to return to her element. The line she signs, "I am incomplete," is not a statement of low self-esteem but a statement of fact from a being who has been breathing air but was meant to breathe water, making her final transformation a homecoming, not a metamorphosis. The film's use of historical context, particularly the television footage of police brutality against civil rights protesters, has been a point of critical contention, with some arguing it is too heavy-handed or that it uses real trauma as mere atmosphere for a genre film. But this integration is deliberate and central to Del Toro's project, refusing to let the audience retreat into a fantasy that is safely separated from the horrors of actual American history. The violence of the fire hoses is a public, sanctioned version of the violence Strickland inflicts in The Secret Lab, and the film's genius is to show that the domestic sphere of 1960s suburbia, with its jello molds and tail-finned cars, is not a happy, innocent past but a violent regime whose mythology of wholesomeness was built on the exclusion and brutalization of a multitude of others. Giles's quiet, lonely life, watching this violence on a black and white screen in his apartment, connects his personal pain of rejection and invisibility to a larger national tragedy, a shared atmosphere of oppression that the love story must literally punch a hole through to survive. The heist sequence, in which Elisa, Giles, and Zelda smuggle the creature out of the lab in a laundry cart, is shot and paced not as a tense thriller, but as a comedic and anxious ballet, a triumph of teamwork by the marginalized who know how to be invisible because they have been forced to perfect that art their entire lives. The plan relies on exploited workers' knowledge of the building's rhythms, the blind spots of security, and the social invisibility of a janitor, a black woman, and an old man. Their success is a moment of pure proletarian joy, a middle finger to the massive, impersonal security state that cannot see what is right under its nose because it fundamentally does not see people like them at all. Dr. Hofstetler's secret assistance, creating a diversion and falsifying records, is the final piece of the puzzle, showing that even within the systems of power, there can be allies who choose wonder over duty, though the film is clear-eyed about the fatal cost of that choice. When Giles is slashed by the frightened creature, the moment is a stark reminder that this is not a tame pet but a wild god. The amphibian man's violence is not evil but reactive, the instinctual self-defense of a terrified captive, and this complexity is crucial to the film's refusal to sentimentalize otherness into mere cuteness or harmlessness. The creature eats Giles's cat, a genuinely distressing act, but the film does not judge him for it, presenting it as a natural, if uncomfortable, expression of his biology, a predator's need that does not negate his capacity for tenderness, a recognition that love across true difference must accept the parts of the other that are not compatible with one's own comfort. The miracle of the hair restoration that follows is not a reward for good behavior, but a kind of interspecies apology, an act of reparative magic that literally reverses a sign of aging, granting Giles a momentary return of youth and self-esteem that is the creature's silent way of saying, "I see what you have lost, and I can give a piece of it back." The color symbolism of the film is so thoroughgoing and articulate that it functions as a secondary script. Elisa's world is green, the green of her apron, her jello, her bathroom tiles, her coat, a color that the film, in an advertising pitch for lime pie, explicitly tags as the future, aligning her with progress, with life, with the watery planet that is to come. Strickland's world is a nauseating chemical yellow, the yellow of his urine, of the industrial cleaning fluids, of the incandescent lights that make everyone look sick, a color of sterility, decay, and a past that refuses to acknowledge its own rot. Red is the color of transformation and passion, the red of the cinema doors, of Elisa's ribbon, of her shoes, and finally of her lipstick and dress, a bold, passionate color she dons when she is ready to fully embrace her desire and her destiny, a visual signal that she is moving from the shadows of green passivity into the active, fiery red of love and rebellion. The film's title, The Shape of Water, is a philosophical statement that encapsulates its entire worldview. Water has no shape of its own. It takes the shape of whatever container it fills, and love, Del Toro argues, works in the same way, a formless, powerful force that adapts to the shape of the lover and the beloved, regardless of their form, species, or language. This metaphor is embodied in the creature himself, an amphibian who takes the shape of his environment, breathing both water and air. But it also applies to Elisa, who takes the shape of the silence around her, and to Giles, who has contorted his entire life to fit the narrow container of a society that hates him. The happy ending is not a permanent form, but a release into the ocean, a dissolution into a love so vast and shapeless that it can hold them both, a final refusal of rigid containers in favor of a boundless, fluid state of being together that is the very definition of freedom. The character of General Frank Hoyt, played with a sneering, patrician menace, represents the inhumanity of high-level bureaucracy, a man who never touches the creature himself, but gives the order for its vivisection with a casual, dismissive wave, treating the miracle of a new life form as a political problem to be solved with a scalpel. His interrogation of Strickland, a scene of two monsters bristling at each other, is a study in the thin line between sanctioned and unsanctioned violence. Hoyt embodies the clean, detached evil of policy, while Strickland embodies the dirty, hands-on evil of enforcement, and the film suggests they are two sides of the same rotten coin, mutually dependent and mutually despising. The rapid severing of Strickland's fingers by the creature in a moment of defensive fury is the first act of violent resistance the creature is able to enact, and the amputation is a symbolic castration, a removal of the torturer's tool, a wound that Strickland's modern medicine tries and fails to truly heal, leaving him a man sutured together with hate. The emotional climax of the film occurs at the canal, a liminal space between the city and the sea, a place of murky, industrial water that promises a passage to the open ocean, but which becomes a site of tragic violence when Strickland arrives, a predator hunting his prey with a righteous fury. The shooting of Giles, the brutal beating of Elisa, and the point-blank shooting of the creature are a sudden, shocking collapse of the fairy tale into brutal realism, a reminder that the forces of reactionary violence are always waiting at the water's edge to punish those who step out of line. Yet this violence is the necessary prelude to the miracle. The creature's self-healing, his swift and deadly retribution as he slashes Strickland's throat, is not a monstrous act but a righteous one, a god finally breaking his chains and reclaiming his power, an execution that is also an act of love, a protection of Elisa's prone body. The final underwater sequence is one of the most emotionally overwhelming endings in contemporary cinema. The creature takes Elisa's apparently lifeless body into the water, and as they sink, the gill-like scars on her neck, the very marks that rendered her mute and incomplete, open at his healing touch, and she gasps, alive, a new being, a creature reborn. The visual rhyme with the film's opening, the floating, the weightlessness, the suspension in a green-blue world, confirms that this has been the destination all along. Not the tragic death of a princess, but the joyful birth of a new kind of being. A creature who no longer needs to speak because she is finally in an environment where language is obsolete. The love that was without shape when it was between a human woman and an amphibian man has finally found its container, which is the ocean itself, an infinite, shapeless, sustaining medium, and the final image of them locked in an embrace, gills billowing gently, is a definitive, radical image of a happily ever after. That is not a return to normalcy but a permanent departure into glorious otherness. Giles's final voiceover, delivered in a tone of wonder and loss, is crucial to the film's ambiguity and its trust in the audience. He says he cannot be certain of the exact truth of what he has shared, but he chooses to believe in the happy ending, a statement that shifts the film's meaning from a literal plot summary to an act of shared faith between the filmmakers and the viewer. This metafictional framing is not a cop-out but an ethical challenge, asking us whether we, in a cynical world, are capable of believing in a love that transcends all categories, whether we can see the impossible as not just a fairy tale, but a political and spiritual possibility worth fighting for. The shape of water is, ultimately, the shape of the story you choose to tell, and the film's final gift is the permission, and the encouragement, to choose the story that heals rather than the story that dissects, to choose the monster who loves over the man who hates. The way Del Toro frames the entire narrative through Giles's memory allows the film to function as a living document of oral storytelling tradition, where fairy tales are not static texts but evolving, emotionally inflected. Accounts that bend toward hope, and this narrative framing device immediately establishes a contract with the viewer that what matters is not empirical verifiability, but emotional resonance. A pact that liberates the film from the constraints of realism while simultaneously grounding it in the very real historical violence of 1962 Baltimore. The apartment building itself, with its peeling paint and creaking floors, becomes a character in its own right, a decaying ark that houses the outcasts who will ultimately survive the flood of conformity that Strickland represents, and the constant sound of rain and dripping pipes creates an oral environment so immersive that audiences almost feel the humidity on their skin. A sensory envelopment that mirrors the film's thematic insistence on immersion, on sinking into otherness rather than standing apart from it in sterile judgment. Elisa's morning routine is a masterclass in cinematic character development without exposition, the camera observing her boiled eggs, her timed masturbation, her methodical polishing of shoes, all actions that convey a life of ordered solitude that is not pathetic but dignified. A woman who has constructed a world of small pleasures and precise rituals that allow her to survive a society that would otherwise erase her entirely. Her job as a janitor, cleaning the messes of men who see themselves as her superiors, places her at the absolute bottom of the institutional hierarchy. Yet this position of invisibility is also her superpower, allowing her access to spaces and secrets that the powerful never think to guard against the cleaning lady, and this inversion of power, where the overlooked become the operatives of miraculous change, is a deeply political statement about who really makes history happen. The friendship between Elisa and Zelda is not sentimentalized, but shown as a pragmatic alliance of mutual protection. Two women who clock in together, who cover for each other's lateness, who share cigarettes and complaints, and whose solidarity is forged in the shared experience of being bodies that the institution regards as disposable labor, a bond that Spencer and Hawkins play with a lived-in, weary affection that speaks volumes about the unglamorous daily heroism of working women. The first meeting between Elisa and the creature is staged with the hushed reverence of a religious encounter, the camera gliding through the dim laboratory as if entering a cathedral, and the moment their eyes lock, there is an immediate, pre-verbal recognition that transcends species, a mutual seeing that the film presents as the rarest and most sacred of human experiences. The discovery of another being who does not look at you as a category, but as a singular, irreplaceable existence. The hard-boiled eggs she offers him are the first sacrament of their communion, a humble gift that breaks the ice between two species, and the creature's gentleness as he takes them, his enormous clawed hand capable of violence but choosing tenderness, immediately complicates any assumption the audience might have about who is the monster in this scenario. The Benny Goodman records, with their exuberant swing and clarinet glissandos, become a bridge across the evolutionary divide, and the creature's visible pleasure in the music, his swaying and his luminous eyes, suggests that art and rhythm are the true universal languages, capable of crossing barriers that words and ideologies cannot breach. Strickland's domestic life is a horror show disguised as a Norman Rockwell painting, his suburban house with its perfect lawn and obedient children revealing itself as a theater of domination where his wife performs mechanical sex on command, and his children buy him a new car that smells of consumerist emptiness. A life so hollow that it makes the creature's tank seem like a palace of authenticity by comparison. The scene where Strickland purchases the teal Cadillac, a car whose color is an unconscious echo of Elise's world, is a brilliant piece of psychological profiling, showing a man so disconnected from his own desires that he buys a symbol of the very otherness he seeks to destroy, a Freudian slip rendered in automotive chrome. Michael Shannon's performance is terrifying precisely because he never plays Strickland as a cartoon villain, but as a man utterly convinced of his own righteousness, a true believer in a hierarchy that places him at the top, and his moments of almost boyish insecurity, his need to be seen as the hero, are more chilling than his overt sadism because they reveal the fragile ego that must be constantly reinforced through violence against the vulnerable. Dr. Hofstetler's divided loyalties create a fascinating third position in the film's political spectrum. A man who serves the Soviet state but secretly believes in scientific wonder. A spy whose cover identity requires him to participate in American militarism while his true self yearns only to understand and protect the miraculous being in the tank. His scenes with the creature, where he speaks to it with a respect that neither Strickland nor the American military ever displays, reveal a scientist who has not lost his soul to Cold War instrumentalism, a man who remembers that before knowledge became a weapon, it was a form of love for the natural world. The truth serum sequence, where his dying words become a Russian nursery rhyme, is one of the most poignant moments in the film. A man reduced to his most primal, innocent self by the very chemical weapons his handlers would have used on others. A bitter irony that underscores the film's argument that the tools of control will inevitably poison those who wield them. Giles's television set, constantly flickering with images of civil rights protests and old Hollywood musicals, functions as a window into the dual consciousness of 1962 America, a nation that produces both the fire hose and the Fred Astaire number. And his channel surfing is not just a character quirk, but a meditation on how ordinary people process historical trauma, alternating between the horror of the news and the escape of fantasy. His failed pass at the pie shop worker, a moment of excruciating vulnerability, is written with a devastating economy. The young man's charming smile curdling into contempt as he reveals his racism and homophobia in a single, crushing sentence, and the fact that Giles returns to the same shop, ordering the same key lime pie, is a portrait of the closet as a repetitive cycle of hope and humiliation that grinds down the spirit over decades. The key lime pie itself, that unnatural green confection that the film explicitly calls the color of the future, becomes a painfully ironic symbol, a future that Giles can taste but never fully inhabit, a sweetness always just out of reach. The heist sequence is a triumph of ensemble storytelling, each character contributing their specific skill set to the impossible plan, and the tension is derived not from high-tech security systems, but from the very human fear of being caught, of being seen, a terror that Black people, queer people, and disabled people in 1962 America lived with every single day. Zelda's refusal to back out, even when she is terrified, even when she knows the stakes are higher for her than for anyone else, is an act of moral courage that the film rightly treats as the axis on which the entire rescue turns. And Spencer's performance in these scenes, her face a battle between fear and loyalty, is some of the finest supporting acting in Del Toro's entire filmography. The laundry cart, that humble vehicle of sanitation workers, becomes a chariot of liberation, and the image of this rickety cart rolling through the sterile corridors, its precious cargo hidden under dirty linens, is a visual gag that is also a profound truth. The saving of the world happens in the margins, carried out by those whom the world refuses to see. The flooding of the bathroom is Elisa's supreme creative act, a transformation of a cramped domestic space into an oceanic sanctuary, and the practical details of her plan, the towels at the door, the bags of salt, the carefully monitored water chemistry, ground the fairy tale in a kind of DIY realism that makes the subsequent love scene feel earned rather than fantastical. Her sexual agency, established from the film's opening minutes, reaches its fulfillment in this scene. And the fact that she is the initiator, the seducer, the one who claims her pleasure without apology, is a radical depiction of female desire that refuses the passive princess model, presenting instead a woman who knows exactly what she wants and is willing to flood her entire apartment to get it. The creature's response, his gentle curiosity and his clear, unambiguous consent communicated through gesture and touch, constructs a model of erotic encounter based on mutual exploration rather than conquest, a direct rebuke to the Strickland model of sexuality as domination, and the submerged, weightless choreography of their union is filmed with a gauzy, dreamlike beauty that avoids exploitation while still conveying genuine erotic heat. The black and white dance fantasy is the film's most daring stylistic gambit, a complete break from the narrative's established visual language that could easily have been jarring or cloying, but which succeeds because it is so earnestly, vulnerably presented as an expression of Elisa's interior life, a dream that the film grants her and by extension grants us. The Art Deco set, the glittering gown, the synchronized footwork that echoes Astaire and Rogers, all of it speaks to Elisa's lifelong consumption of the movies that seep through her floor from the cinema below, and the fantasy is a testament to how popular art forms shape our imagination of love, giving us templates for desire that we then adapt to our own, far messier realities. The creature's participation in this dance, his ability to lead her across a ballroom floor that does not exist, is a poignant wish fulfillment, a desire not just for a lover, but for a partner who can meet you in the spaces where society says you do not belong, a co-conspirator in the impossible. The Rotting Fingers are a masterful piece of body horror that operates as a moral barometer for Strickland's soul. The blackening, stinking flesh a visible sign of the gangrene that was always inside him, and his attempts to hide the decay, to maintain his crisp uniform and his authoritative swagger while his body literally falls apart, is a savage satire of the fragility of toxic masculinity, a power that is always, literally, rotting from within. The reattachment surgery itself, a triumph of medical science that Strickland brags about as proof of his superiority, becomes a grotesque irony when the fingers refuse to heal properly, suggesting that some wounds, the wounds inflicted by a god on a torturer, are beyond the reach of human technology, a curse that no amount of Cold War hubris can undo. When he finally tears the fingers off in a fit of rage, the act is both a surrender to the decay he can no longer deny and a final, desperate attempt to reclaim agency through self-mutilation. A man so incapable of accepting help or showing vulnerability that he would rather rip himself apart. The canal sequence is a Western showdown transposed to a Baltimore waterfront, the solitary avenger facing the escaping outlaws, but the morality is completely inverted, with the man in the white, button-down shirt revealed as the true monster and the fleeing fugitives as the heroes of the story, and Del Toro shoots Strickland's approach with the deliberate, ominous pacing of a slasher film, turning the representative of law and order into the unstoppable killer. Giles's shooting, a sudden burst of violence that leaves him bleeding on the cobblestones, is a gut punch that reminds us of the real cost of defiance, and Jenkins plays the moment not with heroics but with a shocked, almost childlike confusion. An old man who never imagined that his quiet act of friendship would lead to a bullet in his chest. Elisa's confrontation with Strickland, her silent fury as she signs at him and he cannot understand a word, is the film's ultimate reversal of power, the voiceless woman speaking a language the powerful man cannot parse, and his frustration at being locked out of her meaning is a small, satisfying preview of his coming annihilation. The throat-slashing that ends Strickland's life is swift, almost anticlimactic, a sudden gush of red that silences him forever, and the creature does not gloat or linger over the kill, but simply removes the obstacle and turns his attention to Elisa. A prioritization of love over vengeance that elevates the act beyond mere revenge fantasy into something closer to natural justice. The healing of Elisa's scars, the slow transformation of what were once wounds into functioning gills, is a resurrection scene that draws on centuries of religious iconography while subverting it, a pieta that becomes a rebirth, a death that becomes a birth, the creature cradling her body not in grief, but in the confident expectation that she will open her eyes. The gills themselves, those delicate, rippling slits that have been hidden under her collar for the entire film, are the final revelation of her true nature, and the visual of them opening, of her taking her first breath of water, as she has been breathing air her whole life, is a moment of such overwhelming beauty and rightness that it redefines what a happy ending can look like. The film's commitment to practical creature effects over CGI is not just a matter of aesthetic preference, but a philosophical stance, an insistence that the other should have physical presence, weight, and texture, that it should occupy real space alongside the human actors, casting real shadows and making real eye contact, a decision that makes the love story feel tactile and possible rather than a digital fantasy. Doug Jones's performance inside the suit is a feat of physical acting that goes far beyond mere endurance, a full-body creation of a character who must convey godlike dignity, animal fear, romantic tenderness, and predatory instinct without a single line of dialogue. And his work here stands alongside his fawn in Pan's Labyrinth as a definitive example of how suit acting can achieve a depth that purely digital characters rarely reach. The hours of makeup application, the limited vision, the physical strain of water work, all of it is invisible in the final product, replaced by a creature who seems entirely alive, entirely present, and entirely worthy of Elisa's love. The film's Academy Award for Best Picture was not just a win for a genre film, but a cultural statement, a validation of Del Toro's lifelong argument that monsters are worthy of love and that fairy tales are not escapism, but the most direct way to speak about the deepest truths of human experience, and the image of a beaming Del Toro accepting the award. A Mexican immigrant filmmaker who makes movies about outcasts was itself a rebuke to the Stricklands of the world. The score's Oscar was equally deserved, Desplat's music capturing the film's tonal balancing act between whimsy and melancholy, romance and tension, the accordion and flute melodies suggesting both the streets of Paris and the rivers of the Amazon, a sonic cosmopolitanism that mirrors the film's thematic borderlessness. The production design Oscar acknowledged the immense craft of building a world that feels simultaneously real and heightened, a 1962 Baltimore that never exactly existed but which feels truer than history, a dream of the past that speaks directly to the present. The film's relationship to Creature from the Black Lagoon is complex and deeply personal for Del Toro, who has spoken about watching the original as a child and wanting the creature to get the girl, a childhood wish that The Shape of Water finally fulfills. But the film is not a simple correction or a remake. It is a profound reimagining that takes the iconography of the universal monster and invests it with a spiritual and political gravity that the original could never have imagined. The Gill Man was a tragic monster, but he was still a monster, still ultimately a threat to be vanquished, while the amphibian man is a god who has been captured and degraded, a divinity in chains, and the shift from monster to god is the shift that makes the romance possible, that makes the love story a restoration of cosmic order rather than a transgression against it. The Amazonian tribes who worshipped him are not depicted as primitives duped by superstition, but as people who recognize genuine divinity. And the film implicitly asks why their recognition is less valid than the American military's determination to dissect and destroy. The theme of language, its possibilities and its failures, runs through every relationship in the film, from the signing between Elisa and Giles, to the Russian that Hofstetler speaks in his final moments, to the racist and homophobic speech of the pie shop worker, to Strickland's constant verbal self-justifications. And the film builds a hierarchy of communication in which words are often the least reliable medium, used to lie, to dominate, to exclude, while silence and gesture become the languages of truth and connection. Elisa's signing is not subtitled in many key moments, a deliberate choice that places the hearing audience in the position of the outsider, forced to interpret through context and emotion rather than relying on the crutch of text, an experience that gives a tiny taste of what her daily life is like in a world that will not learn her language. When Giles speaks her words aloud during her desperate plea for help, the film stages a moment of perfect translation, the gay man giving voice to the mute woman, both of them rendered invisible by a society that does not want to see or hear them, and their alliance is sealed in that moment of shared utterance. The film's color palette, meticulously controlled by Del Toro and cinematographer Dan Lostson, is a narrative engine in its own right, with the teal green of Elisa's world representing life, the future, and the watery subconscious, while the amber yellow of Strickland's world represents decay, urine, and a rotting past that refuses to die, and the increasing intrusion of red, the color of passion and blood, as the plot accelerates toward its climax, creates a visual urgency that operates below the level of conscious perception. The use of color extends to the smallest details: the green jello that Elisa prepares, the yellow gloves that Zelda wears, the red of the cinema's velvet seats, each choice building a coherent visual argument that supports the film's thematic architecture. And the result is a film that can be understood almost entirely through its color story alone, a triumph of purely visual storytelling. The rain that streaks every window, the water that drips from every ceiling, the steam that billows from every vent, all of it saturates the image with a liquid quality that makes the film feel as though it were shot through a thin layer of water, a constant reminder of the element that will ultimately claim its protagonists. Zelda's home life, glimpsed in a few brief but potent scenes, is a domestic tragedy playing out in miniature. A marriage to a man who does not listen to her, who undermines her authority, who ultimately betrays her under the slightest pressure. And yet the film does not judge her for staying, understanding that a black woman in 1962 has precious few options for escape, that her chatter at work is perhaps her only outlet for a voice that goes unheard in her own home. Her husband's betrayal is not depicted as monstrous evil, but as pathetic weakness, a man so terrified of Strickland's authority that he gives up his wife's confidence without a fight, and his cowardice is in its own way as damning as Strickland's active cruelty. A reminder that systems of oppression are upheld not just by the true believers, but by the millions of ordinary people who will not risk anything to resist. When Zelda returns to work after the climax, her face a mask of grief and relief. She is the survivor who must continue to live in a world that has not changed, and her final scenes carry the weight of that unresolved tension, a realism that the fairy tale ending for Elisa cannot erase. The creature's escape to the ocean is not just a flight to freedom, but a return to the sacred, a reclamation of his status as a god after a period of degradation and torture, and the canal water, murky and polluted as it is, becomes a kind of river Styx, a passage from the land of the dead, the land of laboratories and cattle prods, to the land of the living, the infinite salt-water expanse where he was worshipped. The fact that he takes Elisa with him, that her transformation allows her to follow him into his world rather than his remaining in hers, is the final inversion of the standard fairy tale, which almost always demands that the magical being sacrifice its nature to join the human world. And here, the human is the one who transforms, the human is the one who adapts, the human is the one who discovers that she was never quite human to begin with. This ending is a utopian vision of assimilation in reverse, a dream that the marginalized might not need to squeeze themselves into the dominant culture's narrow container, but might instead slip into a different container entirely, one shaped by love rather than by power. The closing voiceover, with Giles reading his poem about the princess and the monster, is an act of narrative reclamation. A man who has lost his job, lost his chance at love, lost his physical health, and lost his friends, still choosing to frame the story as one of hope, still choosing to believe that love, in whatever shape it comes, is the most powerful force in the universe, and his choice is the film's final gift to the audience, an invitation to make the same choice. The poem itself, with its simple fairy tale cadences, is not great literature, and that is precisely the point. It is the heartfelt, imperfect expression of a man who has spent his life illustrating other people's stories and is finally, at the end, telling his own. The film fades to black on the image of the poem, the words floating on the screen, and then to the underwater embrace that may or may not be real, may or may not be Giles's hopeful invention. And the ambiguity is not a weakness, but the source of the film's enduring power, a space that the viewer must fill with their own capacity for belief. The screenplay, co-written with Vanessa Taylor, operates with the precision of a clockwork mechanism despite its dreamlike surface. Every setup in the first act paying off with devastating elegance in the third. A structural rigor that proves fairy tales require the most careful architecture of any genre because they must earn their magic through an accumulation of believable, grounded details that make the impossible finale feel not just earned but inevitable, a dramatic necessity rather than a fanciful wish. The opening shot, drifting through the submerged apartment with furniture suspended in green water, is not merely a striking image but a thesis statement rendered visually, a declaration that the entire film will take place in a liminal space between air and water, between waking and dreaming, between the historical and the mythical, and the slow, liquid camera movement establishes a pace that the film will maintain, a gentle, inexorable current that carries the viewer toward a destination that cannot be reached by any other route. Elisa's scars, the parallel lines on either side of her neck that rendered her mute, are the film's central mystery and its ultimate revelation. A physical signifier of trauma that the narrative patiently refuses to explain until the final moments, allowing the audience to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, to experience a tiny fraction of the otherness that defines her daily existence. And when the scars finally open to reveal Gills, the revelation is not a twist but a confirmation, a truth that attentive viewers have sensed all along in her comfort in water, her affinity for green, her immediate connection with the creature. The film's treatment of disability is remarkably nuanced, refusing both the narrative of tragic limitation and the narrative of supercrip inspiration, presenting Elisa instead as a fully realized woman whose muteness is neither her defining tragedy nor her secret superpower, but simply one aspect of her being, a mode of existence that has shaped her without reducing her to a single dimension. And this refusal of easy categorization is of a piece with the film's larger argument that all beings exceed the labels that power tries to impose upon them. The creature's healing abilities are introduced gradually, almost casually, a touch that mends Giles's wounded arm, a touch that restores his hair, a touch that brings Elisa back from the edge of death, and this escalating demonstration of power follows the logic of fairy tale magic, which is never explained in mechanical terms but simply presented as a fact of the creature's nature. A godlike capacity for restoration that stands in direct opposition to Strickland's talent for destruction, making the creature not just different from the human villain, but his moral and ontological antithesis, a being whose very touch undoes the damage that humans inflict upon each other and upon the world. The theological implications of this healing power are left deliberately open, the film neither confirming nor denying the creature's divinity, but the reverence with which the camera captures his touch, the hushed score that accompanies his miracles, and the iconographic framing of his final act of resurrection all combine to suggest that the sacred has entered the profane world of the Cold War laboratory, and the appropriate response is not dissection but worship. The Pie Shop, a recurring location that bookends Giles's emotional arc, is a masterfully compressed portrait of American hypocrisy, a brightly lit, chrome-trimmed establishment that sells cheap confections while its handsome young server dispenses smiles that curdle into contempt the moment a gay man expresses interest. And the key lime pie, that lurid green dessert that the film's own dialogue tags as the color of the future, becomes a bitterly ironic emblem of a future that is advertised, but never delivered, a sweetness that curdles on the tongue of anyone who does not fit the narrow demographic of the American dream. Giles's return to this shop, his continued patronage despite the humiliation, speaks to the grinding reality of life in the closet, where one's social options are so limited that even a place of rejection becomes a necessary ritual, a fixed point in a world that offers few alternatives, and his final, defiant severance from this cycle, his refusal to return, is a quiet victory that parallels Elisa's more dramatic liberation. The film's depiction of the Cold War is not merely atmospheric window dressing, but a pointed allegory for the contemporary moment. The binary thinking of the American and Soviet blocs standing in for any rigid ideological system that reduces complex reality to a contest between two monolithic forces, and the creature, who belongs to neither side, who predates both empires and will outlast them both, represents a third term that the binary cannot accommodate, a wild, sacred presence that exposes the absurdity of human conflicts when viewed from the perspective of the ancient, the natural, the divine. General Hoyt and the Soviet handlers are mirror images of each other, both convinced of their own superiority, both willing to destroy what they cannot possess, and their structural equivalence is the film's quiet argument against the very logic of the Cold War, a logic that persists in new forms long after the historical Cold War has ended, a permanent temptation to divide the world into us and them, human and non-human, worthy and disposable. The film's treatment of race is handled with a directness that some critics found uncomfortable, but which is essential to its moral clarity. The television footage of civil rights protesters being battered with fire hoses serving as an inescapable reminder that the violence against the creature is not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of sanctioned brutality against any body that refuses to stay in its assigned place, and Zelda's presence as a black woman navigating this landscape is not a diversity checkbox, but a crucial structural element of the narrative's argument about intersectional solidarity among the marginalized. When Strickland makes his casual racist remarks to Zelda, the film does not use them as period flavor, but as a revelation of his character's fundamental logic. The same logic that allows him to torture the creature without guilt, and Zelda's silent endurance of these remarks, her pragmatic calculation of when to speak and when to absorb, is a portrait of survival under white supremacy that Spencer plays with a lifetime of compressed experience in every flicker of her eyes. The creature's healing abilities are introduced gradually, almost casually, a touch that mends Giles's wounded arm, a touch that restores his hair, a touch that brings Elisa back from the edge of death, and this escalating demonstration of power follows the logic of fairy tale magic, which is never explained in mechanical terms but simply presented as a fact of the creature's nature. A godlike capacity for restoration that stands in direct opposition to Strickland's talent for destruction, making the creature not just different from the human villain, but his moral and ontological antithesis, a being whose very touch undoes the damage that humans inflict upon each other and upon the world. The theological implications of this healing power are left deliberately open, the film neither confirming nor denying the creature's divinity, but the reverence with which the camera captures his touch, the hushed score that accompanies his miracles, and the iconographic framing of his final act of resurrection all combine to suggest that the sacred has entered the profane world of the Cold War laboratory, and the appropriate response is not dissection but worship. The Pie Shop, a recurring location that bookends Giles's emotional arc, is a masterfully compressed portrait of American hypocrisy, a brightly lit, chrome-trimmed establishment that sells cheap confections while its handsome young server dispenses smiles that curdle into contempt the moment a gay man expresses interest, and the key lime pie, that lurid green dessert that the film's own dialogue tags as the color of the future, becomes a bitterly ironic emblem of a future that is advertised, but never delivered, a sweetness that curdles on the tongue of anyone who does not fit the narrow demographic of the American dream. Giles's return to this shop, his continued patronage despite the humiliation, speaks to the grinding reality of life in the closet, where one's social options are so limited that even a place of rejection becomes a necessary ritual, a fixed point in a world that offers few alternatives, and his final, defiant severance from this cycle, his refusal to return, is a quiet victory that parallels Elisa's more dramatic liberation. The film's depiction of the Cold War is not merely atmospheric window dressing, but a pointed allegory for the contemporary moment, the binary thinking of the American and Soviet blocs standing in for any rigid ideological system that reduces complex reality to a contest between two monolithic forces, and the creature, who belongs to neither side, who predates both empires and will outlast them both, represents a third term that the binary cannot accommodate, a wild, sacred presence that exposes the absurdity of human conflicts when viewed from the perspective of the ancient, the natural, the divine. General Hoyt and the Soviet handlers are mirror images of each other, both convinced of their own superiority, both willing to destroy what they cannot possess, and their structural equivalence is the film's quiet argument against the very logic of the Cold War, a logic that persists in new forms long after the historical Cold War has ended, a permanent temptation to divide the world into us and them, human and non-human, worthy and disposable. The film's treatment of race is handled with a directness that some critics found uncomfortable, but which is essential to its moral clarity. The television footage of civil rights protesters being battered with fire hoses serving as an inescapable reminder that the violence against the creature is not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of sanctioned brutality against any body that refuses to stay in its assigned place, and Zelda's presence as a black woman navigating this landscape is not a diversity checkbox, but a crucial structural element of the narrative's argument about intersectional solidarity among the marginalized. When Strickland makes his casual racist remarks to Zelda, the film does not use them as period flavor, but as a revelation of his character's fundamental logic, the same logic that allows him to torture the creature without guilt, and Zelda's silent endurance of these remarks, her pragmatic calculation of when to speak and when to absorb, is a portrait of survival under white supremacy that Spencer plays with a lifetime of compressed experience in every flicker of her eyes. The film's production design extends beyond the principal sets to the smallest props, the period-accurate cleaning supplies that Elisa uses, the specific model of Strickland's Cadillac, the brand of cigarettes that Giles smokes, all of it creating a texture of authenticity that grounds the fantastical elements in a tactile reality, And this commitment to material specificity is a hallmark of Del Toro's approach to fantasy, which always insists that the impossible must be surrounded by the intensely real if it is to have any weight or consequence. The laboratory sets, with their massive pipes, their pressure gauges, their institutional green paint and flickering fluorescent lights, are so convincingly oppressive that the audience can almost smell the disinfectant and the fear. A sensory immersion that makes the creature's tank room, with its watery light and its relative quiet, feel like a sanctuary within a prison, a sacred grotto hidden at the heart of the military-industrial complex. The sound design of the film is a character in itself. The constant drip and gurgle of water, the hum of laboratory machinery, the muffled dialogue bleeding through the floor from the cinema below, all of it creating a sonic environment that is as carefully constructed as the visual one, and the film's silences, of which there are many, are not empty but full, charged with the unspoken communication between Elisa and the creature, between Elisa and Giles, between all the characters who have learned that words can be weapons and silence can be a refuge. The contrast between the organic sounds of water and the mechanical sounds of the laboratory is a sonic expression of the film's central conflict: life against mechanism, fluidity against rigidity, the gurgle of a stream against the crackle of a cattle prod, and the creature's own vocalizations, a mix of clicks, whistles, and low, rumbling tones, are a language that the audience cannot understand but can feel, a communication that bypasses the intellect and speaks directly to the body. The film's dance fantasy, which some critics dismissed as indulgent, is in fact the emotional core of the film's relationship to cinema itself. A moment when Elisa's lifelong consumption of movie musicals, those dreams of grace and romance that have seeped into her apartment from the cinema below, erupts into the narrative as a fully realized vision. And the black and white palette of the sequence is not a gimmick, but a declaration of lineage, a claim that this film belongs to the same tradition as the Astaire and Rogers pictures that taught generations of viewers how to dream of love. The creature's ability to join her in this fantasy, to become the partner she has imagined, is the film's ultimate validation of her desire, a recognition that her longings, however impossible they may seem to a cynical world, are worthy of being fulfilled. And the sequence's brevity, its status as a fleeting interlude rather than a permanent transformation, is precisely what makes it poignant. A glimpse of a world that cannot last, but which is no less real for its transience. The relationship between Giles and his television set is one of the film's most quietly devastating subplots. A portrait of an aging artist who has been rendered obsolete by photography, whose illustrations no longer sell, and who fills his days with the flickering company of a screen that shows him both the horror of the news and the escape of old movies. A man caught between the world as it is and the world as he wishes it could be. His failed attempt to connect with the pie shop server is mirrored in his professional rejection. The advertising executive who tells him that his style is no longer wanted. And these twin rejections, romantic and professional, are the blows that push him toward his decision to help Elisa. A choice that is not made from heroic idealism, but from the desperate recognition that his current life is not worth preserving, and that the only remaining meaning is to be found in solidarity with the other. Outcasts who recognize him as a full human being. The creature's appetite, his consumption of Giles's cat, and his general carnivorous nature, is a deliberate refusal to make him a harmless, sanitized being. A strategic choice by Del Toro to insist that the other is not merely a cute pet, but a wild entity with its own needs and hungers that do not always align with human comfort. And this complexity is essential to the film's moral seriousness, which does not ask the audience to embrace a creature that has been rendered safe, but to embrace a creature that remains dangerous, that remains other, that remains beyond full human comprehension or control. The love between Elisa and the creature is not love despite his wildness, but love that includes his wildness. Love that does not require him to become a vegetarian or a pacifist or a being that can be safely introduced at dinner parties. And this is the most radical aspect of the film's romantic vision. Its insistence that love does not domesticate but liberates, does not tame but sets free. The film's title sequence, created by the design studio that won an award for its work, uses the imagery of eggs and water in a swirling, abstract ballet that condenses the film's themes into a pure, non-narrative form. A kind of visual overture that prepares the audience for the story to come by immersing them in its elemental vocabulary. And the egg, that fragile container of potential life, becomes the film's central symbol, a small, perfect object that Elisa offers to the creature as a gift. A bribe, a lesson, and ultimately a sacrament, the humble hard-boiled egg elevated to the status of a love token, a communion wafer, a promise of the new life that will hatch from their union. The egg's shell, like the water's surface, is a boundary between inside and outside, between the formed and the formless. And the film's narrative arc is the story of breaking through such boundaries, of letting the inside out and the outside in, until the distinction between self and other, human and creature, dissolves in the embracing water. Strickland's wife, a character who appears in only a few brief scenes, is a haunting presence in the film's critique of patriarchal domesticity, a woman who performs her wifely duties with a mechanical precision that mirrors the laboratory's sterile efficiency, and her silent compliance, her lack of any visible inner life, is perhaps the most disturbing thing about the Strickland household, a vision of femininity so thoroughly colonized by masculine power that it has ceased to exist as a separate consciousness. The contrast between this hollow marriage and the vibrant, wordless communion between Elisa and the creature could not be more stark. The heterosexual nuclear family revealed as a site of domination and emptiness, while the interspecies, nonverbal, completely non-normative relationship becomes the locus of genuine intimacy, genuine pleasure, genuine love. A reversal of values that is the film's most direct challenge to the conservative ideology that Strickland claims to defend. The cinematography's use of green and teal is not merely decorative but deeply symbolic. These colors associated with water, with life, with the future, with Elisa herself, and the gradual desaturation of other colors as the film progresses, the increasing dominance of the green-blue spectrum, is a visual expression of the narrative's movement toward the oceanic, toward the dissolution of rigid categories in the embracing water, a chromatic journey from the harsh yellows and grays of the laboratory toward the soft, enveloping green of the final underwater sequence. The lighting design, with its careful attention to the way light behaves underwater, the caustic patterns that dance on the walls of Elisa's apartment, the shimmering reflections that play across the creature's iridescent skin, creates a sense of constant liquidity, a world that is always on the verge of dissolving into water. And this visual instability, this refusal of solid, fixed forms, is the cinematic equivalent of the film's thematic commitment to fluidity over rigidity, love over law. The film's editing rhythm is unusually patient for a contemporary Hollywood production, allowing scenes to breathe, allowing silences to stretch, allowing the audience to sit with the characters in moments of quiet contemplation. And this pacing is a deliberate rejection of the frenetic cutting that characterizes most mainstream cinema, a formal choice that aligns the viewer's experience with Elisa's mode of perception. A world experienced not through the rapid chatter of dialogue, but through the slow, deep observation of gesture, expression, and the subtle shifts of light and shadow. The transitions between scenes are often motivated by visual rhymes or thematic echoes rather than by plot mechanics, a poetic approach to editing that privileges emotional logic over narrative efficiency, and the result is a film that feels less like a story being told and more like a dream being remembered, a series of images and moments that are connected by the deep, associative logic of the unconscious. The creature's final act of violence, the slashing of Strickland's throat, is the only moment in the film when the amphibian man is shown actively killing a human being, and the film stages this act not as a horrific transgression, but as a righteous execution, a natural force finally removing an obstacle to love, and the absence of any moral ambiguity in this moment. The clear framing of Strickland's death as a good and necessary thing is itself a radical political statement, an assertion that some forms of power are so corrupt, so destructive, so irredeemable, that their violent removal is not a tragedy but a liberation. The film does not ask the audience to mourn Strickland or to feel conflicted about his death, and this ethical clarity, this refusal of the false equivalence that characterizes so much of contemporary storytelling, is a bracing reminder that some conflicts are not between two equally valid perspectives, but between love and hate, between freedom and oppression, between the force that heals and the force that wounds. The film's legacy, in the years since its release, has been the subject of ongoing critical discussion, with some scholars arguing that it represents a high-water mark for inclusive storytelling in mainstream cinema, and others critiquing its use of historical trauma as backdrop for a fantasy romance. But what remains indisputable is its impact on the industry. It's proof that a film centered on marginalized characters, made with an unwavering commitment to its director's singular vision, can achieve both critical acclaim and commercial success, a lesson that Hollywood has been slow to fully internalize, but which continues to resonate with filmmakers and audiences who see in The Shape of Water a model for what cinema can be when it refuses to compromise its strangeness. The film's 4 Academy Awards, particularly the Best Picture and Best Director wins, represented a historic moment for genre filmmaking and for Latin American directors. A recognition that the boundaries between art cinema and popular cinema, between the fantastical and the serious, are as permeable as the boundary between air and water in the film's own visual vocabulary. The way the film handles the passage of time is itself a submerged narrative. The calendar on Elisa's wall, the rhythmic repetition of her shifts at the laboratory, the countdown to the creature's scheduled vivisection, all of it creating a quiet urgency that pulses beneath the dreamlike surface. A ticking clock that transforms the leisurely courtship into a race against institutional violence, and this temporal structure, borrowed from thriller conventions but applied to a fairy tale romance, generates a unique hybrid tension, the fear of loss intensifying the sweetness of every shared egg and every Benny Goodman track. The film's deep engagement with the history of cinema extends beyond the explicit references to classic Hollywood musicals and monster movies, reaching into the very grammar of its images. The way Lawson's camera dollies and cranes with the fluidity of a Vincente Minnelli picture. The way the lighting on Hawkins's face echoes the soft focus adoration that silent film cinematographers lavished on their stars, creating a palimpsest of film history that enriches every frame with the accumulated longing of a century of screen romance. The creature's skin, that iridescent surface of blues and greens and silvers that seems to shimmer with its own internal light source, is one of the great achievements of the makeup and effects team. A texture that reads as simultaneously reptilian and divine, alien and beautiful. And the decision to make the creature's surface reflective, to have it catch and throw back the light of the laboratory and the apartment, is a conceptual masterstroke that turns his body into a living mirror, a being, who reflects back the soul of whoever looks at him, revealing Strickland's cruelty as ugliness and Elisa's love as radiance. The practical suit, with its articulated facial features that allowed Jones to convey an extraordinary range of emotion despite the layers of latex, represents a philosophy of creature design that Del Toro has championed throughout his career, a belief that the handcrafted, the tactile, the physically present will always surpass the digitally generated in terms of emotional impact, because the actor's own soul animates the costume in ways that no algorithm can replicate. The film's depiction of masturbation, both Elisa's morning ritual and her later, more desperate attempts to satisfy a desire that has been awakened by the creature, is handled with a frankness that is still rare in mainstream American cinema, a refusal to treat female self-pleasure as either shameful or salacious, presenting it instead as a simple fact of her embodied existence, a way of knowing and comforting herself in a world that offers her no partner, and this foundation of sexual self. Awareness makes her later relationship with the creature feel like a natural progression rather than a sudden awakening, an extension of a sensuality that was always already present, always already active, always already central to her character. Hawkins plays these moments with a complete absence of self-consciousness, an actorly courage that matches her character's existential courage, and the film's unblinking gaze at her pleasure is itself a political act, a demand that female desire be taken as seriously, as centrally, as male desire has always been in the cinematic tradition. The supporting character of Fleming, Strickland's subordinate, who is forced to clean up the bloody aftermath of the finger-severing and who witnesses his boss's escalating instability, serves as a silent Greek chorus of one, his widening eyes and stiffening posture a barometer of how far Strickland has fallen from the controlled, charismatic leader of the opening scenes, and his presence in the margins of the frame. A man who sees everything but says nothing is a chilling reminder of the complicity that allows tyrannical power to operate, the ordinary functionaries who do not actively participate in evil, but who also do nothing to stop it, their silence a form of permission that enables every atrocity that follows. His eventual fate, left ambiguous, is one of the film's few unclosed loops, a question mark that haunts the edges of the happy ending, a suggestion that the world the lovers leave behind is still populated by those who watched and did nothing. The film's use of period-appropriate technology, the enormous pressure chambers in the laboratory, the reel-to-reel tape recorders, the black-and-white television sets, the rotary telephones, is not merely set dressing, but a meditation on the relationship between technology and power, the way that advanced machinery in the hands of the state becomes an instrument of control and destruction rather than liberation, a critique that extends from the Cold War setting to the present day, asking the audience to consider whether our own era's technological marvels are being deployed in the service of surveillance, torture, and the hardening of borders. The creature, who needs no technology to heal, to communicate, to love, stands outside this entire paradigm, a reminder of a different relationship to the world, one based on direct, unmediated contact, touch rather than tools, presence rather than mediation. And his rejection of the laboratory's machinery is a rejection of the entire instrumentalist worldview that sees every being as a resource to be exploited. The film's sound mix during the underwater sequences creates a sonic environment that is unlike anything else in cinema, the muffled, womb-like quality of sound beneath the surface, the way familiar noises become strange and distant, the dominance of low-frequency vibrations that are felt as much as heard. And this sonic immersion is a crucial component of the film's invitation to the audience, a request that we too sink beneath the surface of our everyday perceptions, that we allow ourselves to be submerged in a medium where the usual rules do not apply, where sound behaves differently, where light bends, where bodies float, where love takes a shape we could not have anticipated on dry land. The contrast with the harsh, clanging, metallic sounds of the laboratory, the clang of gates, the buzz of the cattle prod, the bark of Strickland's voice, is a sonic expression of the film's central binary, the organic versus the mechanical, the fluid versus the rigid, the music of the spheres versus the noise of empire. The film's engagement with the fairy tale tradition is not limited to its narrative structure, but extends to its moral architecture. The clear division between good and evil that characterizes the classic tales, but Del Toro complicates this division by making his villains psychologically real, products of a system that has shaped them, while never asking the audience to excuse their actions. A balance that requires immense tonal control, a refusal of both easy demonization and easy redemption. That marks the film as a work for adults rather than children. Strickland is a monster, but he is a monster that America made, a product of its military academies, its suburban dreams, its racial hierarchies, its gospel of success at any cost. And his tragedy, if it can be called that, is that he has fully internalized the values of his culture and is destroyed by the very logic he has mastered, brought down not by external enemies but by the rot that his worldview has bred inside him. The film's portrayal of the Soviet spy network, with its dingy safe houses and its grim functionaries who speak of the creature as a problem, to be eliminated, is a mirror image of the American military apparatus and Hofstetler's tragic position between these two mirroring empires. A man of science who finds himself serving ideologies that have no room for wonder, is a cautionary tale about the fate of intellectual curiosity under any totalizing system, whether capitalist or communist, religious or secular, a warning that the true enemy of the creature, of love of art, is not any particular political party, but the mindset that reduces the world to a chessboard of competing powers. His death, drugged and babbling a nursery rhyme in a language his killers cannot understand, is the death of the cosmopolitan dream, the idea that knowledge and culture can transcend national boundaries, crushed between the two great blocks that have divided the world between them. The film's costume design, particularly for Elisa, charts an emotional journey through fabric and color, her initial uniform of muted greens and practical aprons giving way to the bold red dress, shoes, and headband she wears for the final act, a visual declaration of her transformation from invisible janitor to active heroine, from a woman who hides to a woman who demands to be seen. And the red coat she dons for the canal sequence is the culmination of this arc, a flag of passion and defiance. That makes her visible to Strickland, but also to the audience, to history, to the creature who is waiting for her in the water. The creature himself is, of course, unclothed, his nudity a sign of his prelapsarian innocence, his existence before shame, and the contrast between his nakedness and the elaborate uniforms and suits of the human characters is a quiet commentary on the relationship between clothing and power, the way that those who have the most to hide are always the most elaborately costumed. The film's handling of the creature's capture, communicated through Strickland's terse, self-aggrandizing anecdotes, rather than shown on screen, is a canny narrative choice that preserves the creature's dignity, refusing to depict the moment of his subjugation and instead focusing on the ongoing horror of his imprisonment, a decision that shifts the audience's identification away from the captor's triumph and toward the captive's suffering, a refusal of the colonial adventure narrative that would have framed the capture as a heroic exploit. The Amazonian setting, invoked only through dialogue and the creature's own body, remains an off-screen paradise, a place of origin that is never contaminated by the film's gaze, a lost Eden whose existence is attested to only by the god who was stolen from it. And this restraint is a quiet act of cultural respect, a refusal to exoticize or exploit the indigenous context from which the creature came. The film's depiction of the cinema beneath Elisa's apartment, the Orpheum, with its crumbling grandeur and its dwindling audiences, is an elegy for a certain kind of movie-going experience. The shared dream of the darkened theater, the massive screen, the velvet seats, the sense of occasion, all of which was already vanishing in 1962 and is almost entirely gone today. And the sounds that drift up through Elisa's floor, the muffled dialogue and swelling scores of biblical epics and musical comedies are the soundtrack of a dying era. A reminder that the film we are watching is itself a relic of a tradition that is being eroded by television, by streaming, by the atomization of culture into private screens and individual experiences. The Orpheum's name, a reference to the mythical musician who descended into the underworld to retrieve his beloved, is a clue that Del Toro plants early, a promise that this story too will involve a descent and a retrieval, a journey into the land of the dead from which love will emerge victorious. The film's treatment of the creature's eventual release into the ocean is framed not as a loss but as a consummation. The canal waters mingling with the salt tide, the brackish estuary giving way to the open sea, and the geography of this release, the movement from confinement to freedom, from the bathtub to the canal to the infinite ocean, is a spatial expression of the film's emotional arc, a dilation of possibility that mirrors the expansion of the heart, the gradual opening of a love that was at first secret and small and finally becomes boundless, a love that cannot be contained by any apartment, any laboratory, any nation, any species. The ocean, when it finally appears, is not shown in wide, spectacular shots, but in intimate close-ups of the water's surface. The light playing on the waves, the suggestion of depth beneath, a refusal of the epic in favor of the personal. The cosmic reduced to the scale of two bodies floating together in an embrace that is also a homecoming. The film's final ambiguity, the question of whether the underwater reunion is literal truth or Giles's consoling fiction, is the source of its enduring emotional power, a refusal to close the loop that invites the audience into an active relationship with the story, a choice that we must make, a position we must take, and this ethical dimension of spectatorship. The demand that we decide whether to believe in the impossible or to retreat into cynicism is Del Toro's ultimate gift, a gesture of trust that treats the audience not as passive consumers, but as co-creators of meaning, partners in the act of storytelling. The film does not force the happy ending upon us. It offers it, gently, tentatively, with the full knowledge that some will reject the offer. But for those who accept, for those who choose to believe, the reward is an image of such surpassing beauty and rightness that it can sustain the spirit through many dark nights, a talisman against despair, a reminder that love, like water, can take any shape, can fill any container, can find its way through any crack, and will, in the end, carry us home. The film's use of eggs as a recurring motif reaches its apotheosis in the final act, when the simple hard-boiled egg that Elisa offered as a first gift has become a shared vocabulary, a symbol of the life they have built together in the flooded bathroom. And the egg's dual nature, a fragile shell containing a liquid interior, a boundary between the formed and the formless, makes it the perfect emblem for the film's central preoccupation with containers and what they hold, with the membranes that separate one being from another, and the miraculous moments when those membranes dissolve, when the shell cracks and the life inside flows out into a larger, stranger, more beautiful world. The creature's acceptance of the egg, his gentle, clawed hand taking the small white oval with a reverence that borders on the liturgical, is the first sacrament of their communion, a moment of gift and reception that establishes the terms of their relationship as one of mutual offering rather than extraction or domination. Zelda's relationship with her husband, depicted in a few brief but devastating scenes, is a study in the quiet tragedy of a marriage that has become a cage, a man who does not see his wife, who does not listen when she speaks, who ultimately betrays her trust not out of malice but out of weakness, and the film's refusal to offer any redemption or reconciliation for this marriage. Its clear-eyed acknowledgement that some bonds cannot and should not be repaired is a mature, unsentimental counterpoint to the fairy tale romance at the center of the narrative, A reminder that not all love stories end in transformation, that some are simply endured, survived, left behind when the credits roll. Spencer's performance in these scenes, her face a mask of resignation that briefly cracks to reveal the anger and grief beneath, is a masterclass in conveying a lifetime of disappointment in a few seconds of screen time. And her final appearance, back at work, still chatting, still surviving, is a tribute to the resilience of women who do not get the fairy tale ending but who continue anyway, making a life out of the pieces that remain. The film's depiction of Cold War paranoia, the constant surveillance, the suspicion of anyone who deviates from the norm, the reduction of all value to military utility, creates an atmosphere of claustrophobia that makes the creature's tank feel, paradoxically, like a space of relative freedom, a place where the rules of the surface world are suspended. And this inversion, the prison becoming a sanctuary, the captive becoming a liberator, is central to the film's moral architecture, a world turned upside down in which the laboratory is the true prison and the water is the true home, in which the mute woman speaks the deepest truths and the powerful man's words are nothing but noise. The film's visual strategy reinforces this inversion at every turn, the cramped, airless corridors of the facility shot with wide-angle lenses that exaggerate their oppressive geometry, while the underwater sequences, even in the confined space of the bathtub, are filmed with a floating, weightless grace that suggests limitless possibility, a freedom that has nothing to do with square footage and everything to do with the presence of love. The film's treatment of the creature's intelligence is conveyed through accumulation rather than exposition. The gradual revelation that he understands language, that he responds to music, that he can learn signs, that he possesses a knowledge of healing that surpasses human medicine. And this patient, show-don't-tell approach respects the audience's intelligence while also preserving the creature's mystery. The sense that he is not merely a smart animal, but a being whose cognitive and spiritual capacities operate on a register that human science cannot fully measure or comprehend. A God whose divinity is demonstrated through action rather than asserted through dialogue. The scene in which the creature, having been taught a handful of signs by Elisa, uses them to communicate his own name, a sequence of gestures that she interprets and speaks aloud, is a moment of profound interspecies communion. Two beings from different branches of the tree of life meeting in the middle, constructing a shared language out of the fragments each has offered the other. A new tongue born of love and patience that belongs to no nation, no species, no dictionary. The film's color strategy extends to the grading of the actor's skin tones, with Elisa often lit to emphasize the pale, almost translucent quality of her complexion, a visual suggestion of her amphibious nature, her belonging to the water rather than the land, while Strickland's skin is rendered in sickly yellows and greens that make him look already dead, already rotting. A corpse in a crisp uniform who has not yet realized that his body has begun the process of decomposition, and this chromatic coding of health and sickness, life and death, is a silent, subliminal argument that operates below the level of conscious perception, preparing the audience for the final revelation of who is truly human and who is truly monster. The creature's skin, that shimmering, iridescent surface that seems to glow from within, is the film's chromatic ideal, a synthesis of blue and green and silver that represents the perfect integration of water and light, a beauty that is not human, but which the film teaches us to see as the highest form of beauty, a beauty that the human characters can only approach through acts of love and courage. The film's engagement with the legacy of the universal monsters, and particularly with the creature from the Black Lagoon, is not merely nostalgic homage but a critical intervention in the history of genre cinema, a correction of the original film's tragic ending in which the gill man is shot and killed, his body floating lifeless in the water, a punishment for his desire, and by rewriting this ending, by allowing the creature to survive, to love, to be loved in return, Del Toro is performing an act of cinematic justice, a belated redemption for all the monsters who have been slain. By the final reel, all the others who were deemed unworthy of a happy ending. The film's final image, the creature and Elisa embracing underwater, alive, together, is a direct visual rebuttal to the final image of creature from the Black Lagoon, the dead monster drifting in the current, and the distance between these two images is the distance between a culture that fears the other and a culture that is learning, slowly, painfully, to love it. The film's political argument, that the true threat to America comes not from external enemies, but from the Stricklands within, the men who enforce a narrow definition of humanity through violence and who cloak their sadism in the language of patriotism and piety, was particularly resonant in the political moment of the film's release, but its relevance has only grown in the years since, as the forces of exclusion and demonization that the film critiques have continued to gain power around the world, making The Shape of Water feel less like a period piece and more like a prophecy, a warning about where the logic of purity and supremacy inevitably leads. The film does not offer a political program or a roadmap for resistance, but it offers something perhaps more valuable, an image of solidarity among the marginalized that crosses every boundary of identity, a vision of love as the ultimate refusal of the logic that sorts beings into worthy and disposable. And this image, once seen, is not easily forgotten, a seed planted in the imagination that may flower into action when the moment demands it. The creature's relationship to food, his consumption of the hard-boiled eggs, his devouring of Giles's cat, his acceptance of the fish and other offerings that Elisa provides, is a reminder of the bodily, the carnal, the messy reality of a being who is not a disembodied spirit, but a flesh-and-blood organism with hungers and needs, and the film's willingness to show these appetites, to include the uncomfortable detail of the cat's consumption alongside the tender detail of the shared eggs, is part of its larger commitment to representing love as an embodied experience, not a platonic ideal but a union of bodies that eat and bleed and desire and heal, a love that is all the more miraculous for being rooted in the mud and the blood and the water of actual physical existence. The creature does not transcend his body. He lives in it fully, completely, without shame, and Elisa's love for him is a love for that embodied wholeness, a recognition that his physical otherness is not an obstacle to be overcome, but the very substance of his beauty. The film's score, with its accordion and its waltz time, its whistled melodies and its swelling strings, creates a sonic world that is simultaneously nostalgic and timeless, a music that could belong to a Parisian café in the 1930s, or to an underwater kingdom in a fairy tale, or to the romantic imagination of a mute woman in 1962 Baltimore. And this refusal of a fixed musical identity, this blending of French chanson, Hollywood romance, and something altogether more mysterious, is a sonic expression of the film's thematic borderlessness, its insistence that love, like music, does not respect national boundaries or historical periods or species distinctions. Desplat's theme, that simple, unforgettable melody that recurs throughout the film in various arrangements, becomes a character in its own right, a presence that signals the approach of wonder, the possibility of transformation, the nearness of the creature and all that he represents, and when the full orchestral statement of the theme swells during the final underwater sequence, the accumulated emotional weight of every previous iteration is released in a catharsis that is as much musical as narrative. The film's depiction of the military-industrial complex, with its windowless laboratories, its brutalist architecture, its chain of command that insulates those at the top from the consequences of their orders, is a critique that extends beyond the specific context of the Cold War to encompass any system that prioritizes power over compassion, classification over curiosity, and the creature, who is referred to only as the asset in official communications, is a victim of this mindset, a being whose sacredness is invisible to a bureaucracy that can only see resources to be exploited, threats to be neutralized, data to be extracted. The film's human villains are not aberrations within this system, but its perfect products. Men who have been trained to see the world in terms of problems and solutions, assets and liabilities, us and them, and whose inability to recognize the creature's divinity is not a personal failing but a professional qualification. The mark of a man who can be trusted to do what needs to be done without the interference of conscience or wonder. The scene in which Elisa floods her bathroom, carefully sealing the door with towels, measuring the salt, testing the water temperature, is a sequence of such methodical tenderness that it elevates domestic labor to the status of ritual, a preparation of sacred space that transforms a cramped apartment bathroom into a temple of love, and the attention to detail, the rolls of tape, the bags of salt, the patient adjustments of the faucet, grounds the fairy tale in the kind of practical, hands-on problem-solving that women's work has always entailed, a reminder that magic, when it arrives, usually requires someone to clean up afterward, to prepare the space, to do the unglamorous labor that makes the miracle possible. The flooding itself, the water rising above the tiles, the furniture floating free, the light refracting through the submerged room, is an image of liberation achieved not through escape, but through transformation. The familiar space made strange and beautiful by the simple addition of enough water to float a god.